Marlon Brando and Francis Ford Coppola. The Dark Secrets of Apocalypse Now. 138 days of shooting, 1 million feet of film, 3 heart attacks, and 1 Marlon Brando. The filming of Apocalypse Now went down as one of the most chaotic productions in cinema history. But behind all these numbers lies a dark story that nobody knows. The war between Marlon Brando and Francis Ford Coppola. Brando hadn't read the script, hadn't prepared for his role, and didn't care about Coppola's vision. So how did these two powerful egos come together and create a masterpiece? Before you continue watching this video, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because deep within this story lie truths that Hollywood never told you. In May 1976, crew members, actors, and technical staff from all over the world were flocking to Manila, Philippines. Francis Ford Coppola had won his second Oscar for The Godfather Part 2 just 2 years earlier and had become one of Hollywood's most powerful names. But now he had a bigger dream in his mind, to bring the darkness of the Vietnam War, the brutality and the depths of humanity, to the big screen, inspired by Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness. This wouldn't just be a film, it would be an experience. But Coppola didn't know back then that this experience would nearly destroy him. The project's foundations actually stretched back years, to 1969. That year, young screenwriter John Milius had begun working on the idea of transporting Conrad's novel into a modern context. Milius wanted to tell the horror of the Vietnam War, the dark side of the American dream, and how the intoxication of power transforms people. When he finished the script, several names were considered to direct this project. Initially, George Lucas wanted to do it, but American Graffiti and subsequently the Star Wars projects pulled him in a different direction. Then Francis Ford Coppola stepped in and saw this project as the work of his life. Everything had gone wrong from the start. First, casting was done for the role of Colonel Willard, and Harvey Keitel was chosen. Keitel had gone to the Philippines and shot for 2 weeks. However, one morning Coppola woke up and decided that Keitel wasn't dark enough for this role, and he threw away 2 weeks of shooting. Millions of dollars went up in smoke, production stopped, and the search began for a new lead actor. Martin Sheen entered the picture. Young, ambitious, and ready to do anything for the role. But Sheen's life would also nearly end in this film. Sheen had decided to use method acting techniques to the fullest in bringing the Willard character to life. The character needed to be an alcoholic, so Sheen actually started drinking. The character needed to be psychologically broken, so Sheen let himself fall into that breakdown. The results were horrific, but the raw reality we see in the film was the result of these sacrifices. When filming began in the Philippine jungles, the boundaries between reality and fiction blurred. Coppola wanted real helicopters, and the Philippine government provided military helicopters. However, these helicopters weren't just provided for filming. A real insurgency was ongoing in the north of the Philippines, and the government would sometimes recall the helicopters, use them against the insurgents, then send them back to the film. So the helicopters used in filming one day could be killing real people the next day, then reenacting the Vietnam War on set the following day. This reality poisoned the entire atmosphere of the set. Crew members felt like they were shooting a film in the middle of a real war. Real explosives were used. There were even real corpses on the sets, purchased from a local supplier. One day, production designer Dean Tavoularis noticed that the corpses hanging in a corner of the set weren't fake. These were real human corpses, bought from funeral homes. Tavoularis was shocked and reported the situation to Coppola. Coppola's reaction was surprising. He shrugged and said, "Maybe it's good for the film's atmosphere." Nothing like this had ever happened in Hollywood history. The set was gradually turning into a field of madness. Drugs were everywhere. Dennis Hopper was constantly under the influence of marijuana and cocaine while playing the photojournalist character. One scene had to be repeated nearly 40 times because Hopper couldn't remember his lines. Coppola yelled at him. Hopper smiled and said, "Man, I'm already in character, don't you get it?" But the real storm was yet to come, because Marlon Brando was still in America, and nobody knew what condition he was in. Coppola had signed Brando for the role of Colonel Kurtz for $3 million plus 3% of the net profits. This deal was an astronomical figure in the mid-1970s. Brando would only work for 3 weeks. However, there was a condition in the contract. Brando would prepare for his role, lose weight, read the script, and develop his character together with Coppola. He was expected to read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness book. He needed to work on the character's psychology, discuss with the director for hours, and understand the film's vision. Coppola remembered Brando's Don Vito Corleone performance in The Godfather, how much Brando had worked for that film, how he had prepared for the character, how he had endured hours of makeup sessions. Coppola thought Brando would show the same professionalism. After all, Kurtz was an even more complex character than Corleone, a man who was once an idealistic American officer, but became deified in the Vietnamese jungle, made his own rules, and crossed all moral boundaries. Playing this role required serious preparation. Brando did none of these things. At his home in Los Angeles, he didn't read the script Coppola had sent. He didn't even touch the Heart of Darkness book. Far from losing weight, he gained more. For days he wouldn't leave his house, ordering food, watching television, and doing nothing. His assistants were worried but couldn't say anything to Brando, because Brando was going through one of the darkest periods of his career at that time. A few years earlier,
His controversial performance in Last Tango in Paris had worn him down. The media had torn him apart. His private life had descended into chaos. 2 of his marriages had collapsed. His relationships with his children were broken. He would frequently escape to his island in Tahiti, living there for weeks without talking to anyone. Friends thought Brando was depressed, but no one could say it openly. In September 1976, 4 months into shooting, the day of Brando's arrival finally came. Coppola woke up early that morning with tremendous pressure on him. By now he had spent more than $20 million. The studio United Artists was calling every day demanding an accounting. The Philippine government was threatening to withdraw the helicopters because a real insurgency had started in the north of the country. Martin Sheen was struggling with alcoholism and was just weeks away from having a heart attack. Dennis Hopper was a drug addict and would give meaningless speeches on set for hours. Typhoon Olga had destroyed half the set, and rebuilding them had taken months. And now, in the middle of all this chaos, the man who would play the film's most critical character was arriving. Coppola didn't go to Manila Airport. He was too nervous, afraid of the confrontation. Instead, he sent production manager Fred Roos. Roos had known Brando for many years and knew how to work with him. When the helicopter appeared on the runway, Coppola's heart raced. The door opened, and Marlon Brando stepped out. Coppola froze at the sight before him. Brando was almost unrecognizable. His contract said he would lose weight, but Brando had done the opposite. He was over 100 kilos. His face was bloated, his body bulky. There was no trace of his former athletic posture. His head was completely bald, which wasn't in the script either. The Kurtz character was supposed to have long hair, but Brando had shaved his head. He had huge suitcases with him, but they didn't contain costumes or character notes, just his personal belongings. When Coppola approached and said hello, Brando's first question was, "Who is Kurtz?" The director looked on in astonishment for a moment. "The character you're going to play," he said. Brando shrugged. "I didn't read the script," he said. "I didn't read Heart of Darkness either. But it's okay, we'll work it out together." Coppola's heart sank. Millions of dollars, months of shooting, the entire crew's efforts, and Brando had come unprepared. But what could he do? Sending him back wasn't possible. The studio would kill him. The film would remain unfinished. His only option was to work with Brando. At that moment, Coppola found himself on the edge of a cliff. If he didn't work with Brando, he couldn't finish the film. If he worked with Brando, the entire vision of the film would be jeopardized. Because the Kurtz character was thin, ascetic, a man who had gone mad in the Vietnamese jungle. Brando, on the other hand, was fat, unprepared, and indifferent. That night, Coppola thought for hours in his trailer. His wife Eleanor was beside him, trying to calm him down. But Coppola couldn't calm down. "This man has destroyed me," he was saying. "I gave him $3 million, and he hasn't even read the script. What am I going to do now?" Eleanor told her husband to think rationally. Brando is still Brando. When he gets in front of that camera, he can create magic. Maybe his being unprepared even means something. Coppola listened to these words but wasn't convinced. The first days were a complete disaster. Brando would wake up late in the mornings and come to the set in the afternoon. The crew would wait for him for hours, which cost the production tens of thousands of dollars per day. When he got in front of the camera, he didn't know his lines. Coppola would try to explain the scenes to him, and Brando would constantly jump to other topics. Once, Coppola tried to explain Kurtz's motivation to Brando. This man went there as an idealist, but what he saw changed him. He said, Brando listened, then said this, "Francis, that's nonsense. People aren't idealistic. People just want power." Kurtz went there for power. Coppola tried to object, but Brando was no longer listening. One day, Brando asked, "Why is this character here?" When Coppola tried to answer, Brando cut him off. "I don't think you know either." This statement deeply wounded Coppola because it was partly true. Coppola actually hadn't fully figured out the film's ending. How should Kurtz die? Why should he die? Why did Willard have to kill him? These questions had been spinning in Coppola's head for months, but he couldn't find a clear answer. The tension increased with each passing day. Crew members could hear Coppola arguing with Brando for hours in the trailers. Voices were raised, doors were slammed. Once when Coppola came out, his face was bright red and tears were streaming from his eyes. "This man is going to kill me," he said. But they still continued shooting because there was no turning back. The pressure from United Artists Studio increased with each passing day. Production president David Picker would call Coppola every day, asking for reports. "Francis, when will this film be finished? The budget has completely ballooned. We said 20 million. Now we're approaching 30 million. What's the situation with Brando?" Coppola would lie. "Everything's fine. It's going great," he would say. But the reality was very different. However, the interesting thing was this. This chaos was perfectly reflected in the film's atmosphere. Brando's unpreparedness seemed to feed the character's madness. Kurtz was already an unpredictable, uncontrollable man. And so was Brando. Coppola realized this and developed a strategy. Instead of trying to control Brando, he began to integrate his chaos into the film. This was a turning point in Coppola's directorial career. He was usually a man who tried to control everything, who planned every scene down to the smallest detail. But with Brando, this wasn't possible. Brando didn't follow plans, didn't follow the script, didn't follow anything. Coppola would either fire him, which wasn't possible, or learn to dance with him. Brando had a weight problem, so Coppola decided to shoot him in shadows. Actually, this created the film's most iconic visual style. The Kurtz character was constantly shot in darkness, with only part of his face visible. This choice gave the character a mysterious and terrifying aura. The audience couldn't see Kurtz fully. There was only a silhouette in the shadows, a voice, a presence. This visual strategy made Kurtz an almost mythological figure. Brando's baldness had also shocked Coppola at first, but then he saw how it served the character's ascetic, almost priest-like appearance. Kurtz was a man who had deified himself in the depths of the jungle, and the baldness gave him a religious aura. Vietnamese villagers worshipped him, and this worship was reinforced by Kurtz's physical appearance. The line problem was more complex. Brando refused to memorize the texts. Instead, he wanted to improvise. At first Coppola objected to this, but then he gave up, and something surprising happened. Brando's improvisations were more powerful than the script. The dialogues written by screenwriter John Milius were well written, but Brando's instant creations were more authentic, more striking. The horror scene was entirely Brando's instant creation. This famous phrase taken from Joseph Conrad's novel was in the script, but Brando's way of saying it, his whisper, his look, was entirely his creation. Much of that famous monologue was things Brando thought of and said on set at that moment. In one scene, Brando talked about an incident in the Vietnam War. American soldiers had vaccinated Vietnamese children against smallpox. Then Viet Cong guerrillas came and cut off all the vaccinated arms. There was a light in Brando's eyes as he told this story. His voice trembled. Perfection, he was saying. Will purged of being, of morality, of the murder urge, perfect, crystal clear will. This monologue became one of the film's most unforgettable scenes, and was entirely Brando's improvisation. However, this process was destroying Coppola. Every night he would go to his trailer and watch edits for hours, re-editing the film in his head. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He was losing weight. His hair was starting to fall out. One day, in the middle of the set, next to the cameras, he collapsed. For a moment, the crew waited in fear. Was this a heart attack? No, Coppola had just collapsed from exhaustion. When he got up, there was a wild light in his eyes. "This film is my Vietnam," he said. "I'm dying here every day." These words would later be used in the documentary Hearts of Darkness and would perfectly summarize Coppola's state of mind at that time. Eleanor Coppola saw her husband going a little more crazy every day. When she woke up at midnight, she would find Francis sitting outside the trailer, staring into the darkness. "What are you doing?" she would ask, and Francis would say, "Thinking." When Eleanor asked, "About what?" Francis's answer was always the same, "Everything." Martin Sheen's actual heart attack stopped production for 6 weeks. They were on set that day. Sheen was shooting a scene and suddenly fell to the ground. His left arm was numb. There was a terrible pain in his chest. When the ambulance arrived, Sheen was almost unconscious. He was taken to the hospital. Doctors made the diagnosis, heart attack. A 36-year-old man, in the most important role of his career, had a heart attack in the Philippine jungle. Why? Alcohol, stress, overwork, inadequate nutrition. Sheen had lived inside the character for months, had pushed his limits, and his body couldn't take it. Coppola went to the hospital, and when he saw Sheen, he cried. "It's all my fault," he said. "I did this to you." But Sheen, smiling from his hospital bed, said, "Francis, I'm here. After I recover, I'll come back. We'll finish the film." During that period, Coppola began to think he had completely lost his mind. At night, he couldn't sleep. For days, he would watch the same scenes over and over. His wife, Eleanor Coppola, thought he was having a nervous breakdown. One night, Francis told her this: "I don't think I can finish this film. But if I don't finish it, I'll lose everything." Eleanor was trying to support her husband, but she herself was collapsing. Being in the Philippines, having left her children far away, seeing her husband go a little more crazy every day, was wearing her down. But she kept the camera running. Eleanor was documenting this entire process, and years later these images would be used in the documentary Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse. Brando was supposed to stay for 3 weeks, but stayed for almost 2 months. Because shooting was progressing so slowly that no plan was holding, Brando would come in a different mood every day. One day he was full of brilliant ideas, cooperative and creative. The next day he was completely withdrawn, giving monosyllabic answers, not wanting to do anything. One morning Brando came to the set and told Coppola, "I don't want to work today." When Coppola asked why, Brando's answer was just because. The crew waited in vain that day. They didn't shoot anything. The next day Brando came back, acted as if nothing had happened, and gave a great performance. This unpredictability kept the production constantly tense. No one knew what tomorrow would bring. One day, in desperation, Coppola asked Brando, "Marlon, why are you putting me in such a difficult position?" Brando looked at him for a long time and gave this answer: "Francis, you don't need me to play a character. You need me to be a monster. And monsters can't be controlled." At that moment, Coppola understood everything. Brando wasn't acting a role. Brando was living inside the character. Kurtz's madness, moral collapse, detachment from humanity were already present in Brando's behavior on set. When the director realized this truth, he completely changed his approach. He was no longer trying to direct Brando, he was just turning on the camera and watching him. This was an unprecedented directorial approach in cinema history. Coppola had completely let go of control, and had begun to trust Brando's leadership, and this trust produced surprising results. One of the most iconic scenes, that long monologue where Kurtz talks to Willard, half his face visible in the darkness, was shot exactly this way. Coppola turned on the camera, told Brando, "Talk," and stepped back. Brando talked for 15 minutes without stopping. He talked about the Vietnam War, morality, power, horror, the nature of humanity. Much of the time what he was saying couldn't even be understood because he was whispering, but the camera recorded everything. When Coppola later examined that 15-minute take, he realized he had a treasure in his hands. He extracted a 3-minute scene from it, and this scene became one of the film's most memorable moments. Brando's performance in that scene was just a 15-minute improvisation, but it went down in cinema history. That look in his eyes, that tremor in his voice, that deep darkness in his words, were all reflections of Brando's state of mind at that moment. Another unforgettable scene was the scene where Kurtz reads poetry. It wasn't in the script, but one day Brando brought T.S. Eliot's poem The Hollow Men to the set. "I want to read this," he said. Coppola was surprised but agreed. Brando sat in a dark corner, a book in his hand, and began to read the poem in a whisper. "We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw." His voice was barely audible, but the camera captured every word. This scene became one of the film's most poetic and powerful moments. Brando hadn't prepared it, hadn't rehearsed it. He just felt it in that moment, and did it. But the production was far from over. When Brando left, Coppola still hadn't figured out the film's ending. How should Kurtz die? For months he thought, shot dozens of different versions. Finally they shot a scene they called the water buffalo ceremony. During a ceremony where a real buffalo was being sacrificed by the local people, Willard kills Kurtz. This scene became one of the film's most controversial scenes because a real animal had been killed in front of the camera. Animal rights activists protested. Critics debated whether it was art or exploitation. Coppola defended his choice. "We were showing the reality of violence. Real violence is ugly, uncomfortable. We couldn't fake it." When the 238 days of shooting finally ended, Coppola returned to America. But he had 230 hours of raw footage, and didn't know how to put it together. The editing room became a new ordeal. For a year, working 16 hours every day, he tried to shape the film. He shot 3 different endings. Finally, to meet the 1979 Cannes Film Festival deadline, he sent a version without a final ending. The screening at Cannes was legendary. The film ended, the credits started rolling, and for 10 minutes no one in the hall moved. The silence was so intense that people didn't know what to think. Then applause erupted. The film won the Palme d'Or. However, Coppola still wasn't satisfied. He went back to the film, re-edited it, and finally released it to theaters in August 1979. Critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece. Some found it complex and inaccessible. However, over time, Apocalypse Now came to be recognized as one of the greatest films in cinema history. Brando's performance, with only 15 minutes of screen time, became one of the most iconic performances in cinema history. But what about those dark secrets? What about the real war between Brando and Coppola? The truth is, this film wasn't just a Vietnam War film. This film was a reflection of two men's internal wars. Coppola learned that his perfectionism and need for control were his own Kurtz, and Brando proved that his unpreparedness and indifference were actually a performance. They both pushed each other to the brink of madness, and there, from that chaos, a masterpiece was born. Years later, in an interview, Coppola said this: "Marlon almost killed me, but at the same time he taught me the most important lesson I would ever learn about cinema. Sometimes losing control is gaining control." Brando, on the other hand, almost never talked about Apocalypse Now. Only once, toward the end of his life, he is rumored to have told a friend this: "That film was the best work I ever did, because I never worked." Here's where the truth lies. Apocalypse Now didn't become the film it was planned to be. Half of what was in the script wasn't shot. Half of what was shot wasn't used. What Brando was supposed to do never happened. But this chaos, this lack of planning, this madness, made the film more powerful. Because the Vietnam War wasn't a planned war either. It wasn't a controllable operation. It too was chaos, madness. And Coppola and Brando lived this madness, on set, every day. 238 days of shooting, 1 million feet of film, 3 heart attacks, and 1 Marlon Brando. These are the numbers, but what the numbers can't tell is that electricity, that energy, that violence born from the collision of two geniuses. Apocalypse Now isn't just a film, it's an experience. And behind that experience are dark secrets that nobody knows. The chaos Brando brought to the sets, Coppola's nervous breakdowns, real corpses, real violence, real madness. It's all there, in every frame, in every shadow, in every silence. So what do we learn from this story? Sometimes the greatest works of art don't turn out as planned. Sometimes they're born from chaos. Sometimes two people create a masterpiece by destroying each other. Marlon Brando and Francis Ford Coppola fought a war in the Philippine jungle, and from that war came one of the greatest films in cinema history. Isn't this truth itself more striking than any fiction?